and it's a snowy morning in Montreal, where the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy is located. And I want to welcome you all here this morning, and especially our guest speaker, Oleksandr Svitych. It's a pleasure, Alex, to have you with us this morning. I was in touch with Oleksandr Svitych, I guess I can't remember exactly how long ago, but several months ago. He sent us a message informing us about the publication of his book, The Rise of the Capital State and Neo-Nationalism in New Polanian Moment. And I was in email communication with him, had the pleasure of reading part of the book. I have not read the whole book, but which I found very compelling and very interesting. And I immediately invited him to give us a talk for today, to have this webinar and this opportunity to learn more about his book and to learn and to engage with many of you who are online today. So just to introduce Oleksandr, Oleksandr Svitych is Associate Professor of the School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University in India. I asked him just before we let you all in exactly where it's located, and apparently it's not far from Delhi, but not in the center of Delhi. So this is where he has his academic appointment. Professor Svitych completed his PhD in the Department of Political Science of the National University of Singapore. And this book, to which he will speak today, grew out of his doctoral research conducted in Singapore, as well as visiting appointments that he had at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics, Sciences Po in Paris. I apologize, I have not had an opportunity to read the whole book, but I was very stimulated and curious to read on because of Professor Svitych's expansion upon our understanding of nationalist, neo-nationalist, and populist movements and politics today. These are contested terms, according to Oleksandr Svitych, and I think we'll hear more about that today, and it will generate conversation and dialogue between us. Oleksandr Svitych is a young scholar who is contributing to Polanyi studies of contemporary society, and I and my colleagues, we all welcome young Polanyian scholars who will carry the torch further. And if you permit me, Oleksandr, I just want to make one final comment, and that is that Oleksandr Svitych is from Ukraine, and he just told me before we opened the doors to all of you that he was on his way back home just 2 days before the invasion, and of course canceled his trip, and he has close family, including his parents, who are in Ukraine. So personally, I would like to express my solidarity with you, your family, and your people in this very, very difficult situation. And so I now turn it over to you. You will speak for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. And I would prefer that our Q&A be oral, where we can, we're about 30 people, I think, online. If it's manageable, you can raise your hands. I will look for hands and you can ask your questions. If there are too many questions, we might try to do a combination of hand raising, oral questions, as well as entering comments and questions in the chat. Welcome, Oleksandr, and I now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Margie. Good morning, everyone, or good time of the day. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Margie, Anna, and the Karl Polanyi Institute of Political Economy for giving me the opportunity to share my research. And as Margie correctly pointed out, I have been animated by and inspired by Karl Polanyi since my PhD years, and I continue to get inspiration from his work up till today. And also special thanks for expressing your solidarity. So I would like to talk today about the perspectives which we can get from Karl Polanyi on the global rise of populism. Actually, I call this phenomenon neo-nationalism, and I have certain reasons to choose this term, which I will explicate in a while. So what I'm going to do, I will share some slides with you to facilitate my talk and to provide you some visuals of my research. All right. So hopefully you can see the screen. And I would like to begin by saying that my talk will be based on the book, as Margie pointed out, which was published by Brill in November last year. And it's called The Rise of the Capital State and Neo-Nationalism, a New Polanyian Moment. Now, this is the third volume of the series published by Brill. And in fact, the advantage of this series is that it tries to conduct the study of populism across the world, including in Asia, in Global South, in Europe, and so on. Right, so the series is called Global Populisms, and it is edited by Emis Konechny and Amitabh Volrak. All right, so to begin with, I would like to say and briefly outline the main argument of my book and the main argument which I would like to bring forward today. I believe that the global rise of what has been commonly called populism, or what I prefer to call neo-nationalism, can be understood as a reaction to a renewed Polanyian transformation. Now, Polanyi, of course, is famous for his book, among other works, The Great Transformation. In my opinion, in our contemporary world of neoliberal globalization and capitalism, we can definitely apply Polanyian insights to understand this phenomenon. And definitely the recent political developments epitomized by Brexit, by Trump, also call for a systemic analysis of this phenomenon. What I would like to do, I would like to bring forward a political economic perspective on the rise of neo-nationalism, and more specifically, a critical political economic perspective. Now, as Robert Cox earlier reminded us, critical political economy tries to question the unquestioned, right? It tries to demystify relations of power, and it tries to expose domination and hidden assumptions behind mainstream politics. So in my opinion, critical political economy, and especially Polanyian insights, offer an opportunity to look into deeper causes of neo-nationalism. Now, of course, there has been a huge explosion of studies, of debates, of academic research, of policy advising on the rise of populism, and the field keeps growing, and I think it will keep growing. Some threads which have propelled this debate forward, for example, are the following: the culture versus the economy debate, the demand versus supply contextual factors, the role of charismatic leaders, and so on. However, I think it is political economy which offers the tools and the language to look for deeper and coherent and systematic analysis which underpins the rise of neo-nationalism. Now, I would like to highlight that, and this is one of the contributions which I make in my book, in my opinion, is that the word populism is very ambiguous. more often than not, it has been overused or even abused. And there are a number of reasons why I prefer to choose the term neo-nationalism. So I define neo-nationalism as an assertive or sometimes even aggressive identity maintenance project, which intersects at the three things: nationalism as the common minimum denominator, so to speak, populism, and radicalism. I really do believe that nationalism is the key fundamental feature which drives and animates many of the so-called populist movements, whether on the right or on the left of the political spectrum. Now, of course, there is a conceptual and empirical difference between the right and the left neo-nationalisms, but in both cases, these movements, parties, and leaders are driven by the questions of welfare, sovereignty, and identity. And nationalism is the key ideological feature behind this phenomenon. Now, the second important feature of neo-nationalism, or the second element, is populism. Again, it has been defined and conceptualized in many ways as a thin ideology, as a style, as a rhetoric, as a type of leadership. In my case, I prefer to use the ideological or the ideational definition of populism, which understands populism as the division of society into the pure people, so-called pure people, and corrupt elite, right? Now, of course, importantly, I also share the view that populism is an empty signifier. It can get attached to a host ideology. Again, usually on the right, it is some nationalistic ideologies. On the left, it is more solidarity-based ideologies. But populism in itself is ambiguous and empty, both conceptually and empirically. Hence, by itself, in my opinion, it is very misleading. And finally, the last element of neo-nationalism is radicalism, which can be understood as a drastic call to reform the system. Usually reform, especially applied in the Western context, things like liberal democracy and capitalism. Now, let me move forward. And based on this ideological driven definition of neo-nationalism, the second point I would like to bring forward is that we really need to make a clear distinction between not only right-wing and left-wing neo-nationalisms, but also, more importantly, and I think this point has been overlooked quite often, within the right-wing camp itself, there are important subtleties. So what I mean is the following. Actually, what my research shows, and by the way, I'm not the only one to document this, but still, I have found that in many cases, including in my case studies like France, Australia, and Hungary, the so-called right-wing political parties have become actually, and ironically, paradoxically, left-leaning in their economic positions. Of course, at the same time, they maintain conservative outlook in their cultural positions, right? Whether support for traditional values or revolt against immigration, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and so on. So to emphasize, many of the so-called right-wing or radical right or ultra-nationalist parties have adapted their ideological, rhetorical, and program appeals. And they have become, in fact, more left-leaning, right? So this is the middle line of the table, which I'm sharing with you. And in fact, this is one example of the Polanyian social protection movement. And well, as we know, Polanyi famously argued that society tries to reinvent itself when there is a push forward of the free market utopia. And he also implied, even though he emphasized state protection, he also actually implied that protection can take both progressive and regressive form. Well, actually, these type of neo-nationalist parties, which are right-wing in their cultural outlook, but left-leaning in their economic outlook, are precisely one example, can be understood as one example of such Polanyian social protection against the market. And of course, there is also traditionally left-wing political parties which are left-wing in their economic stances, like Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, Bernie Sanders' campaign in the US, and many others. And finally, of course, there is still the neoliberal populist parties which advocate free market policies and ideologies and are also conservative in their cultural dimension. So this is the second point which I wanted to bring forward. And this distinction later on serves as a foundation of how I collect data on neo-nationalism and how I measure the levels of neo-nationalism. So to give you just a quick bird's eye view, this is the rise of neo-nationalism in the organization of, in the members of the Economic Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So while I was conducting this research, it was 35 countries, now it's 36. So actually, this is the average data, the voting results of neo-nationalist parties, both left-wing and right-wing neo-nationalist parties, across all of these countries for 36 years, so between 1980 and 2015. Or actually, I also collected some final data for the 2020 to illustrate that this trend has continued further. Now, this graph maps empirically the conceptualization which I discussed earlier, right? So again, we have three types of political parties. Two of them are Polanyian social protection movements. So the red one is left-leaning neo-nationalist camp. The blue one is right-wing neo-nationalist camp, which is again to emphasize actually left-leaning in its economic stances. And then, of course, traditionally, we also have these gray areas, which are the neoliberal populists. And by the way, let me just quickly come back. Here in the middle camp, the new right-wing, right, I have also put the case of Donald Trump, but there's also a footnote, and I measure the results, or I collect data based on parties' rhetorical and programmatic appeals, right? So in other words, on what the leaders say, rather what they do. So, and while Donald Trump campaigned for his presidency, he actually advocated for some protection of the workers, but as he gained power, he shifted to the neoliberal populist camp. All right. Now, let me briefly outline the framework which I use, which forms the foundation of my main argument, which is the rise of neo-nationalism can be understood as a societal Polanyian protection against the increased marketization of state and society. Now, on the left side are some of the classic concepts developed by Karl Polanyi, such as economic liberalism, market economy, embeddedness and disembeddedness, and of course, the double movement. So I will not spend much time discussing this, but I would like to emphasize that Karl Polanyi's intellectual and conceptual arsenal can and should be scaled up to our times, to the times of neoliberal globalization and neoliberalism as the latest phase of capitalist development. And when applied to our times, I think that these concepts can be reinterpreted as follows. Economic liberalism has given way to neoliberalism. Then we have market fundamentalism, and I borrow this term from Fred Block and Margaret Summers, which I think is very effective. It reflects this religious creed, and the belief in the efficiency and power of free market economy. Finally, when Polanyi talks about disembeddedness, we have seen, in fact, in theory, of course, neoliberalism promotes deregulation of the state, but actually existing neoliberalism, as we know, in fact, calls for re-regulation of the state. So in fact, it's re-embeddedness or embedded neoliberalism. The state needs to be strong in order to ensure that marketization keeps going and in order to ensure that the rules of the free market are protected and promoted. Finally, the double movement concept in my book is reinterpreted as, on the one hand, the rise of the capitalist state, which I'm going to explain, and as a reaction, it triggers neo-nationalist social societal protection. All right. So let me lay out briefly my capitalist state theory. Well, as you have noticed, I use Polanyi's work as my beginning and starting point, but I also try to be a bit more inventive in a way, more creative, also, of course, try to stay very empirical. And I think that to understand neo-nationalism, it's important to undertake a comprehensive multi-level analysis. So my capitalist state theory incorporates three important elements. The first element is structural, or the level of the institutional change, which says that the main cause or the main enabling condition of neo-nationalism has been the increased marketization of the state and society. And I conceptualize this process in my book as the rise of the capital state. Now, I frame my argument in broader research on state transformations, and there are also a few other concepts which are worth attention in these regards, such as competition state by Philip Cerny, transnational state by William Robinson. Then we have other concepts like neo-plural transnationalism, embedded multi-level governance. The reason why I conceptualize the changes in the state during globalization as the capital state is because I would like to maintain the focus at the national level. Now, of course, there are opinions and there are scholars which highlight that globalization has been too strong, the state is withering away, the state has become passive, it only accepts the rules of the international competition. Well, I don't agree on this, and I think that we need to focus at the state level, okay? So the capital state, the way I conceptualize it, is the state which puts priorities of the market over the public good. So this is the basic definition, but also, as I try to show in my book, it can be also understood in a more sociological way. So the capital state is the latest paradigm of state development, which promotes commodification of labor, land, and money during the latest period of neoliberal globalized development. And as I noticed, as you may notice, in this definition, of course, I also draw a lot on Polanyi's idea of fictitious commodities. All right, so of course, the structural level matters, and it forms the breeding ground for the rise of social alienation, for social decline, for people's revolt against the system. But at the same time, I believe that perceptions matter. So apart from the institutional level, I also try to engage with the subjective and intersubjective level to understand neo-nationalism. In other words, how does structural change translate to people's experiences? And this is what I try to understand in my case studies. How do Hungarians or French people or Australians or South Koreans experience these huge sweeping transformations in their daily lives? And whether these make them more sensitive to the neo-nationalist appeals. And finally, the third and important element of the capital state theory is, of course, the discursive or political supply element, which is the element of agency. whereas the first one focused on structure, the last one focuses on agency, right? This is where political parties, movements matter. Their symbolic appeals, their rhetorical strategies, the way they use manipulations, the way they talk to people, and the way they provide neo-nationalist solutions to channel away the discontent which is generated by the capital state transformation. So to summarize, I develop, or I try to update and scale up Polanyi framework, and I understand neo-nationalism as the result or interplay between socio-economic transformations, their perceptions by the people, and the political strategy of neo-nationalist parties. And in doing this, I drew a lot on different scholarships, of course, international and political and comparative political economy, critical social theory, social movements, party competition, electoral politics, and others. All right. So to conclude, explicating my capital state theory, what I also do in my book, at the level of perceptions, I try to dig in using some sociological analysis, and I also show that there are mechanisms which connect the capital state transformation to people's lives, right? And these mechanisms are nostalgia, status frustration, and status anxiety, and relative deprivation. In other words, what I find is that people experience the sweeping marketization of societies through nostalgia for better days, through status anxiety over their jobs or over their livelihoods and households, and through comparing themselves to others, especially to minorities. And finally, there are also a few relational mechanisms which facilitate this whole process, such as political opportunity structures, discursive strategies. So this is the way how parties connect to voters. And by the way, this is the framework which was developed in the contentious politics literature. So I also make use of this. Now, a very quick word on the methods and data which I use. The main thrust of my methodology is mixed methods. I try to combine the comparative breadth of statistical analysis with the deepness of case studies. Talking about quantitative analysis, so when I develop my capital state theory, I use the structural equation modeling factor analysis. My capital state index consists of 13 specific indicators, and I'm going to show them to you in a moment. Also, of course, I conduct regression and correlation analysis, and this serves as a first plausibility prop of my theory. So regression analysis allows us to evaluate the effects of the capital state against the levels of neo-nationalism. And then based on this, I select several case studies. Now, when conceptualizing and measuring neo-nationalism, I draw a lot on party manifestos. I also read the headlines from party websites. I also draw on secondary literature and the Manifesto Project database. From a more qualitative perspective, I also make use of the existing ethnographic studies in Australia, in Hungary, in France, in South Korea. Also in focus, I also use the results of some focus group studies and also of the available opinion surveys. So to conclude, my data set overall spans across OECD countries and across 36 years, and it covers about 100 neo-nationalist parties. More of them are, the majority of them are left-wing neo-nationalist parties, and about 40 of them are right-wing neo-nationalist parties. Okay, this is a bit complicated table, but to try to summarize it, this is the capital state index, which is an empirical manifestation of the concept of the capital state. Now, what matters here is that there are three mechanisms which reproduce marketization of state and society and which actually facilitate increased commodification. And in fact, these are extended versions of Karl Polanyi's so-called fictitious commodities. So land, labor, and money. And in my reinterpretation, this is privatization of social protective mechanisms like healthcare, education, and housing. So privatization of livelihood, if you will, right, or social production capacity. Then I have the second mechanism, which is the increased power of capital over labor, operationalized via decreasing trade union density and increased decreased corporate taxation and increased flexibility, right? So Polanyi talked about commodification of labor. This is how I reinterpret his concept. And finally, the last component, the big mechanism of the capital state, is the financialization of the economy, which I operationalize in two ways. First of all, the increased openness to capital, and finally, the transnational aspect of the capital state, that is the increased inequality. Okay, so I haven't included here the levels of the capital state, but my research shows that across 36 years, the levels of the capital state have been on the rise in most societies. But of course, this broad trend overlooks important national specificities. And this is the role that the capital state index fulfills, okay? Now, if you pay attention to the summary index, especially to the 2015 column, this is how the countries have been ranked. So as you can see in this chart, the top places are occupied by the United States and the UK. Now, this is the 2015 data, but actually, intuitively, it resonates with the very concrete political neo-nationalist developments in these countries, which are, of course, Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump. Now, we can discuss this table, of course, but I would like probably briefly to say that in some respect, it resembles the so-called varieties of capitalism approach, but in many other ways, actually, it diverges from this. And I think what this table represents is what I call the process of what I call uneven convergence. So on the one hand, there are very serious, very substantial variations in the rise of the capital state within specific societies. On the other hand, towards 2015, more or less many of these countries have converged on the high scores of the capital state index, right? So let me illustrate this with these four countries. And these are the four case studies which I used in my research, right? Hungary, Australia, France, and South Korea. So as you can see, initially, they have started from different positions. And the reason for that is because all of these countries share different political, economic legacies, different institutions, and different cultures. So, for example, Hungary is the former socialist state. South Korea is the the so-called developmental state. France has used the political economic tradition of dirigism, what is now called post-dirigisms. And Australia is the classic example of the liberal state, right? So different starting points, but essentially toward the end, they are all converging on the higher levels of marketization, right? So the high score of the capital state. Now, a very brief example of a quantitative analysis. So I evaluate the effects of the capital state on neo-nationalism, controlling for some other alternative explanations, right, which are famous, which are prominent, like globalization, unemployment, immigration, inequality, or membership in EU or NAFTA. And what this result shows is that the capital state index bears the biggest effect on neo-nationalism, of course, controlling for all other factors. At the same time, the effect of unemployment and inequality is also substantial, but this does not contradict the capital state theory. Actually, it vindicates it because, according to my conceptualization, the capital state by design promotes policies and its mechanisms are such that they facilitate flexible labor, precarious work, the rise of inequality. So in a way, these results were expected, but still the effect of the capital state is the highest. And when translated to the common metric, because this is done in different metrics, right? If I translate this to the common metric, the standard deviation units, actually the effect of the capital state is 4 times higher than unemployment and 3 times higher than roughly than inequality. One final piece of quantitative evidence, this is an example of an interaction. And I think this is important because what it shows is that as the levels of the capital state rise, voters feel more threatened by migrants. Hence, they vote for neo-nationalist parties. So in other words, this result goes against the direct causal link between immigration and vote for neo-nationalist parties. What it shows, or in a way, what it provides evidence for, is that economic insecurity and economic restructuring and cultural insecurities coexist in tandem, right? So insecurities against migration or multiculturalism do not exist in a vacuum. So the political economic restructuring provides a background for this. And this is what this model shows. There is interaction between economy and culture. Okay, a very quick word on the 4 case studies and the reason why I chose them in my book. Well, first of all, the Hungarian case is very exciting because it's a very illustrative case, right? It shows the high levels of change in the capital state restructuring and high increase in neo-nationalism, exemplified by the Jobbik party, but also very interestingly by the Fidesz, which is a conservative nationalist party, but which actually in power, but which actually adopted a lot of symbols and rhetoric from Jobbik. So in a way, Fidesz became more radical, while Jobbik softened its radicalism. The other confirming case is South Korea, but here the dynamics are the opposite. The capital state restructuring has been quite modest, and this can be explained by the developmentalist legacy of the South Korean political economy. And also the levels of radical challenging the system are not that high. In fact, the South Korean case is peculiar because there is no neo-nationalism, but at the same time, there was a rise of the left-wing progressive parties, which formed a challenge to the existing status quo and to the existing competition between the liberals and the conservatives. Finally, 2 disconfirming cases: the high levels of the capital state in Australia, but at the same time, the rise and quick fall of neo-nationalism represented by Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, right-wing neo-nationalist party. Finally, France is also, in a way, a disconfirming case because it has also seen the modest restructuring of the economy and state in the pro-market fashion. But at the same time, the levels of the neo-nationalism have been very high, both on the right-wing side, and the case study in my book is the Front National, renamed to National Rally, Marine Le Pen, but also on the left-wing spectrum, such as France Insoumise or France Unbowed, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And of course, these confirming cases are also interesting to understand why my expected outcomes did not happen, right? And confirmative cases are good to understand the causal links and the schemas and the mechanisms which connect the capital state restructuring to neo-nationalist vote. These are some of the illustrations how these double movements look like in these specific societies, right? So again, if you look at the case of Hungary, bottom left, there is a clear double movement taking place. On the one hand, there is the rise of the capital state, and there is a reaction in the form of the rise of neo-nationalism. In a way, a similar but more modest or emergent dynamic is observed in the South Korean case, represented by the Democratic Labour Party, as a reaction to the increased marketization since the 1997, which is a critical juncture, and this was the Asian financial crisis. And finally, two other cases, France and Australia. By the way, I would like also to mention that in my case studies, I take the historical institutionalist approach, which is the idea that change is endogenous, change is gradual, it's incremental, and change is agency focused. In other words, all these transformations are led by specific agents. They are led by specific governments. They are enabled by specific policies. And this is what I try to trace and to expose in my case studies. All right. Well, these are some of the concluding findings which I try to bring together in the final chapter of my book. I will not read through them, but let me probably bring forward the most important 5 major points, in my opinion. There are 10 here, but I would like to highlight 5 most important. Well, first of all, hopefully my book shows that Polanyian legacy is still applicable today, and it can be reinterpreted, and it can be applied to understand the systemic causes of the rise of neo-nationalism, right? So this is my first contribution in adapting and applying a Polanyian framework to understand the rise of neo-nationalism. My second contribution is, as I mentioned earlier, is that we need to be very cautious with the term populism. I think it is very ambiguous to lump together in one camp authoritarian neoliberal leaders like Trump or Modi in India or Bolsonaro in Brazil, together with more social protectionist right-wing leaders and parties like Front National in France and many others. So ideology needs to be taken seriously. And this is why populism can be an ambiguous label. And I think neo-nationalism performs a better analytical role here. Okay, my third contribution is that I try to contribute to the discussions of the state transformation with my concept of the capital state. And on the one hand, I challenge the neoliberal homogenization argument because I show that there are distinct variations in transformation of the political economies of countries. On the other hand, I change the varieties of capitalism approach, which says that there are static institutional legacies and they do not change. Well, actually, the capitalist state index shows that there is convergence, even though it is uneven. My first contribution is to transcend the culture versus economy debate. Now, of course, there have been prominent works on either side, but I think it's important to understand that both factors matter. Furthermore, there is interaction between marketization of economy and society and the insecurity experienced on the cultural aspects. What I show in my case studies is that it was economic restructuring experienced through status anxiety, through threat of social decline, through nostalgia, which prompted people to feel threatened by the other, whether migrants, whether aboriginals, whether Chinese people, whether Asian people, and so on and so forth. So in fact, this economic restructuring forms a background for cultural insecurities. And finally, of course, political entrepreneurs, populist nationalists, they use these dynamics to channel away people's anxiety onto the other. And finally, my fifth and final, probably major contribution is that in the last chapter, I tried to understand the relationship between the capitalist state, neo-nationalism, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I come to the conclusion that in one way, the capitalist state formed the background, it enabled the pandemic because the capitalist state restructuring weakened the welfare states, it made people more precarious, it created these inequalities. So in a way, it formed the conditions for the tragic consequences of the pandemic. On the other hand, as the pandemic unfolded, it crystallized the effects of the capital state. So the capital state was both the cause and effect of the pandemic in a way. Again, we saw on the one hand, many Keynesian, in a way, or pseudo-Keynesian approaches in trying to handle the pandemic, such as disbursing stimulus packages, protecting employees, or trying to stimulate employers not to fire workers. But these measures were somewhat temporary and piecemeal, and they do not represent the radical breakaway from the existing system. And my very final point, and which is the concluding point of the book, is of course there is space for optimism, and actually the COVID-19 pandemic provides such an opportunity as every crisis does. And what needs to be done, if we come back to the original insights or to updated Polanyi framework, is the logic of scaling back the capital state, protecting the work arrangements, protecting the labor, trying to reinforce social production capacities such as labor, or such as education, healthcare, and household support, and trying to mitigate inequalities. So in other words, we need to decommodify these dynamics. We need to make sure that the capital state is scaled back, and this can form the foundation of a more human and a more just socio-economic order and system. And this is exactly how the populist nationalism appeal can be tackled at its root. So on this note, I would like to stop, and one more time to thank the Karl Polanyi Institute for this opportunity, and I will be happy to hear your opinions and to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Oleksandr. Maybe if you take away your slides and I can go to gallery view. There's a lot of stock in your talk, and a lot more certainly in the book. And I know, having read only the introduction and the conclusion, I found that I was very eager to understand better, which I think you've helped us somewhat today, your methodology and this combination of a conceptual reframing or rethinking of terms that seem to be used, very loosely, and we think we understand what we are talking about when we mention populism and nationalism and so on. And I know that there is at least one person who's no doubt going to jump in because he just published a book, co-authored a book on the subject. I will resist asking any questions myself, and we are not that many people, and my preference is for people to raise a hand and engage with you orally. And so if there is, I'm looking to see if there are any hands as yet. Is there anyone who would like to, I mean, there's a lot of, as I say, there's a lot of stock in your talk. It's very, the book is very dense, and the use of Polanyi, I think, bringing Polanyi into your framework is very interesting. I guess what I would ask you, but I because I don't see any hands at the moment, is that you do end on an optimistic note, and I would like to share that optimism with you. And I'm not saying that I feel fully pessimistic or hopeless, but let me ask you a question: why can't we just not anticipate a continuation of a capital state conceptual framework that you develop with a reactive, ad hoc, piecemeal response to crises or challenges as they emerge? You mentioned, during the COVID period, we had a very massive Keynesian moment. People were even referring to, a new Marshall Plan as countries really stepped up to try to mitigate the health crisis and the economic crisis. We also saw ugly competitive behavior on the part of countries that were not at all generous in sharing the available tools, whatever tools were available at the time. Why would you, I want to share your optimism, but what leads you to feeling that we are in a situation where we will have more of a, let's say, using terms, left-wing, populist type reaction to the current, what many have called polycrises, the collision of political, economic, environmental, and social crises globally?
Well, thank you for this excellent question, Margie. So I think I will try to approach this question from two sides. First of all, the side of the state, right? So on the one hand, I do believe that these dynamics of the increased marketization of state and society will continue. And well, there are few signs that it is decreasing. And even in the times of crisis, like the pandemic, or in the times of wars even, we can still witness the rollout of neoliberal policies. We can still witness the lifting up of protection of of the rights of workers, social protection, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I can see also that there are very interesting experiments which are conducted by the state themselves. So one experiment which comes to my mind is the universal basic income, which has been talked a lot, which has been discussed about a lot, first in the academic circles, but then increasingly in policymaking circles. And even some countries have adopted this or tried to experiment with this idea. And in a way, it can serve as, one safety net or one way to protect societies from, falling behind. And well, of course, it's also in a way dangerous because these discussions can be hijacked. And well, the interesting part about UBI is that it seems to be justified by all ideological forces. Even free market ideologists say that universal basic income can be useful because it makes the welfare system more efficient, right? It can substitute the welfare system. So in a way, there is a danger, of course, there still needs to be a strong welfare state, and the welfare state needs to be revived. But at the same time, if combined with such bold or radical experiments as universal basic income, I think this calls for some cautious optimism, right? So on the other hand, and this is the second part where I see some optimism coming from, I think change does not necessarily will or can come from the top down, but also from the society itself. There is an increasing number of social movements which try to re-embed the state in society. In India, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of movements, which in a way are very diffused, are very specific. Some focus on land grabs, some focus on environmental protection, some focus on women's rights, and so on and so forth. But many of them are united by this ethos in trying to resist marketization. Again, of course, some have been hijacked by institutions like IMF or World Bank, but still, I think there has been, especially the pandemic has facilitated this, there has been an explosion, if not in social movements per se, but in also mutual aid networks, solidarity campaigns across the globe. So I think this is another way where optimism comes from. And when combined, this top-down, experimenting, trying to tame the system or to scale back the capital state, combined with this bottom-up, bold experiments as well, and social activism. Now, I think this definitely makes space for some still cautious, but optimism.
Would anybody else like to jump in so that I don't engage in a conversation with Oleksandr, tempting as it may be? Can I invite? I mean, without putting any pressure, but can I invite Daniel Drage, perhaps to make a comment? Based on the talk, you haven't had access to the book, Daniel, but given how close you are to this subject, I think it would be interesting for us to hear, and maybe you could put on your camera. There you are.
Yeah.
So Daniel H., Professor Emeritus from York University, Toronto.
Well, first I wanted to say that I learned a lot, Alex, from this talk, from your talk, because it was quite original to step back from the politics, the political project of populism, and to look at the populist insurgency across the world through this optic of capital state theory. I was really an attempt to formalize systematically the different explanations and factors that have supported a realignment across the world of state-market relations with very different templates. So I must say you are a very innovative thinker and very bold to do that. Now, I think you also lose something, or perhaps it's not in this talk, but maybe you'll make some comments about this. So one of the ways definitionally to think about populism is not so much in a formal sense, but it's a very different kind of political phenomena. It's a system of messaging around hate speech and the big lie. And it really has scooped its base from the left. The collapse of the red walls in Britain, in France, in New Delhi, in many countries, the base of the populist insurgency is the historic left base of the working class, precarious people and new employment relations. So I would actually, I think you have to deal with what is original about populism. And while I applaud you for your work on capital state, there is a danger of not really dealing with the agency behind populism and why it is succeeding to capture high office across the world and to be able to, many of the leaders are not one-time wonders, right? They are Orban, others are winning constantly in the Anglosphere. It has changed very dramatically since the welfare days. So I want to stop here, but you can see where I'm going with. So you've got your original thesis, and then there's something, what I think, still to be addressed and supplemented. Maybe it makes some comments.
Thank you, Professor Dresch. And by the way, I have started reading your book, and it is absolutely captivating. So I do not disagree with you on the account that populism includes all that what you have mentioned, like it's a system of specific messaging, which is very provocative, right? It's hate speech, it includes lies, and also there are other agents I think you talk about in the book, like there are certain intermediaries, activists, right, which also enable this messaging. So I definitely agree with these dynamics, and of course they need to be accounted for. I think our differences come from two things. The first one is the way we conceptualize populism, right? So for me, again, populism, while definitely it is also a form of style or a form of communication, it's also important to understand that populism needs some host ideology. So I do insist on the ideological emphasis here because ideology matters a lot. And when you look at this vast array of populist parties, leaders, and movements, so one way to understand what unites them, but also what is so different about them, is their different ideological leanings, right? And populism here is only a carrier which is attached, in a way, to the host ideology. So this is why I tried to differentiate between three aspects. The way I measure, of course, as a result of this conceptualization, my measurements are also solely on the elections, right? I only focus on the political parties, on their results in national parliaments. And of course, this can be and should be challenged because, well, as you, of course, I think as you imply, there are other ways to be a populist outside of formal politics, right? But I still think that, you know, elections are at the heart of the democratic politics, and also from a methods point of view, the data on elections and on voting are easier to probably collect and compare, right? So this is one thing I wanted to mention. And secondly, again, I do not disagree with you, and I'm going to read further the book, which is really interesting. But my thesis is really about, or my angle is about the political economy of populism or neo-nationalism, right? So I think political economy really digs into these systemic causes. Well, let me give you an example. So some scholars or some academics have tried to understand populism as a democratic decline, right? As a threat to democracy. Well, actually, this talk has been also reproduced a lot by liberal media, by papers like The Guardian and others. But what this misses, actually, this democracy versus authoritarianism debate, is what is lying underneath. What are the systemic causes which are lurking behind. So I think the political economy has this arsenal, whether Polanyi or Gramsci or Marx. Well, there are many other tools which can be used to dig beneath, right? And to understand what are these sweeping transformations which create the conditions within which these things, like you mentioned, can thrive. Hate speech, lies, provocations, right? So in a way, my level of abstraction is probably, or level of analysis is different. But let me again reemphasize, I do not disagree with you. I think what you said is absolutely correct. And thanks again for reaching out to me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Interesting.
I see Attila.
Attila,
Yeah.
I was going to say, did you want to intervene? I see you took off you're no longer muted.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to. Yes.
Attila, Budapest. Yes.
Okay. So first of all, very interesting and compelling. I would be happy to ask again about these indices, this capital state index, and think it over again. But I very much agree with I think the ultimate analytical point is that when Polanyi is talking about double movement, it's very difficult to operationalize it. Actually, it's more a claim than actually really telling what the mechanism is. It may be because Polanyi consciously wanted to leave this open in various ways, which means that in all era, we need to reconfigure this. And I think this approach from a political economic point of view is extremely important. I mean, Polanyi, I think, actually very authentic for Polanyi, because for him, political economy was very, very important. I'm more of a sociologist, but I studied a lot of political economics, but I really enjoy it. Nonetheless, I wanted to raise a couple of points which might be helpful for further discussions. And unfortunately, I know the Hungarian case too well. And following this, and then the debates are going on here, whether it's really a double movement or not. A lot of people actually opt for some kind of what Jobke was also pointing out, this kind of a neoliberal nationalism. And there are reasons why they are doing so. I'm not saying that I'm absolutely sharing their position, but I would really qualify this whether the economic policy of the Orbán government have been left-leaning. There have been leftist elements in it, but it's in that sense, in case we look at it very calmly, at least it is a mix. Because I just give you some ideas, which might be low corporate tax, extremely low corporate tax, low income tax, and very much declining redistribution rates. So in case you look at that. An absolutely open support for foreign investment, direct state support in promoting this, in a very open economy, by the way. It's a super open economy. And as related to that also in terms of social policy, it's very much on the idea of deserving. It's very much on the idea of a neoliberal social policy, namely that just came out with a law saying that, oh, in case you're in trouble, try to solve it yourself. In case that doesn't work, then there is your family. If that doesn't work, then there is the church. If that doesn't work, there are the NGOs, my dear. And if that doesn't work, then the local councils. And after that, the central government. That's basically what they said, blatantly, clearly. So in that sense, it would qualify for a number of extremely clear neoliberal points. I see your point as well, for instance, in many other decisions, but I think my ultimate instinct in this is that here the state intervention is not really social protection, but reshuffling control over resources. So the ultimate point here is, so that it wants to change cards because the market outcome is not okay. So let's intervene it and let's reshuffle the cards and let's play again the whole game again, right? That's my ultimate feeling. Concerning migration, and actually I'm working on that as well a lot. 3 days ago, my new book came out in that. So I've been thinking a lot about this. Of course, you are right. There is nothing where the immigration level can explain such attitudes and things. You are absolutely right. This has been in the literature, and many other people proved your point. Nonetheless, we cannot say that it is completely detached from migration, because migration has to be seen as being in a process of being marketized, and then many of the countries which are interested in this have been in the forefront, East European countries, in the forefront in terms of demographic fragility, massive outmigration, some immigration, and being, in this midst. This fragility is very important. You pointed insecurity, I just add to this, but related also to migration. And also very interestingly, in case you look at very closely, which are the countries which are most negative on the so-called migrants or immigration, this is Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Estonia. And why other countries in Eastern Europe, like Romania, Poland. Poland is very hard on LGBTQ and so on and so on, but not on migrants. I mean, uncomparable to the Hungarian levels. And this actually gives an idea that we are talking about relatively privileged economies which have been in some kind of a welfare system which is under threat continuously because of the neoliberal era. And maybe the reaction of the people is very much related to this fragility of the existing welfare system, while many countries, actually Romania, Bulgaria, they did nothing in terms of defending anything which remained from socialism. It went to Poland as well. It was far less. I think what in terms of the rise of capitalism, what Greshkovich and Bola were saying is embedding neoliberalism. That makes some point. There's a point here which we need to think over. So altogether, so congratulations. I think you are shooting absolutely in the right way, but maybe the case studies are even more tantalizing than we would like to see that. At least this is what I learned during this analysis. So that would be my point. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Attila. I really appreciate your insightful comments. Let me just, if I may, briefly respond. Actually, what you have said about neoliberal Hungary and Fidesz, trying to promote, well, on the one hand, leftist policies, but also these very low corporate taxes, openness to investments. This is exactly what I say in the Hungarian case study, right? The socialist protectionist movement, in my case study, has been mostly or was mostly represented not by Fidesz, but by Jobbik, a right-wing neo-nationalist party. So actually, Jobbik, although it was extreme, and it was very, anti-Semitist, but then it tried to soften its radicalism. On the economic dimension, it clearly advocated what they called ecological socialism, trying to break against the corporations, trying to promote independent Hungarian farmers. I even quote Gabor Warner, the leader of Jobbik, in several occasions. So Jobbik was a very clear example of a political agent trying to resist this increased marketization. Now, of course, because of the electoral competition, and I actually highlight this mechanism in all of my case studies, because of the party competition, Fidesz borrowed some of the appeal from Jobbik, right? And what also both Jobbik and Fidesz did, they offered not only, especially Jobbik, leftist economic solutions, but neo-national symbols, so that people can either channel away their anxieties or distance themselves and unite with the national greatness. So, for example, as you know, of course, as a Hungarian, Fidesz proclaimed the 4th of June as the national commemoration day, right, because of the Trianon trauma. So this politics of irredentism, when Hungary lost a lot of its territories, right, and also symbolically and physically represented by the monuments of the Tural bird all over Hungary, but also on the borders of Hungary and its neighbors, Ukraine, Slovakia, Austria, and so on, right? So this politics of tapping into national greatness, actually what Fidesz has promoted. And again, talking about immigration, totally agree with you. By the way, in 2015, before moving to Singapore, I was still in Hungary. So I have lived in Hungary for 7 years. And in 2015, when I witnessed this refugee crisis firsthand, when you go to the Keleti railway station, you see scores of people, right? And the government really not doing too much, to facilitate, to help them. So again, this migration discourse was used very instrumentally by Fidesz, so that Fidesz could portray itself as the protector, so that a convenient scapegoat could be also used. And of course, also Fidesz, as you know, was very instrumental in the anti-Soros campaign, right? Again, in all the case studies, including Hungary, I highlight that there is this double polarization. On the one, there is resentment against the elites, like in this case, against Soros, against his open foundation, against this multicultural, detached, cosmopolitan elites in Hungary. But on the other hand, the second type of polarization goes towards minorities, migrants, previously, especially by Jobbik, towards gypsies, right? So this double polarization takes place in all the case studies which I examined. But thank you so much. I mean, these are very pertinent comments. And by the way, I haven't mentioned this, but I will be more than happy to share the draft of my manuscript. If you can just shoot me, if anybody can shoot me an email, I will be happy to send it over. Thank you.
That's great. That's a terrific offer. We could perhaps, Anna's still with us. We could, be the conduit. We could be the messenger and circulate that. I think Daniel Drage wants to come in again, but before that, is there anyone else who has a comment or a question before? And I have a comment too, but okay, go ahead, Daniel. I think you wanted to say, you're muted.
Well, I think it was good that Oleksandr began by wrestling with this concept of populism. I'm not sure he's wrestled it to the ground. But in Carl Sandburg's poem, he begins with a very good definition or about the ambiguity of the term. The poem begins, "I am the people, I am the mob." Populism has produced Napoleons, he says, and Lincolns. So when you look at left and right populism, you see that it is entangled conceptually and practically because politicians don't read academics about neat distinctions, right? The problem is that populism, authoritarianism, nationalism, and nativism are all kind of jumbled up and carried along by messaging. And the messaging, of course, is very different because Obrador, he defines himself as pro-poor. And of course, that has a very clear set of imperatives and goals. But under the same rubric of populism or capital state theory, of course, Bolsonaro, the Anglosphere, and many other, Modi, etc., they all had their very different views and needs of capital state theory. So I am more cautioning as an old man writing on these subjects to rely less on models and more on what I call a selective reading of the best of Polanyi or other theorists, because my sense is, even listening to Oleksandr this morning, he was very fresh, but he didn't follow the models too much. He came up with his own. So I'm a big advocate of that. And that's why it was very informative for participants this morning to look at with fresh eyes the populist problematic by attempting to formalize it around a theory. But at the same time, you lost something. This is my final point, that in political economy, the politics and the economy often go in opposite directions, and they don't necessarily are as self-reinforcing as you think, because hate speech and the big lie and the collapse of the middle of the left-right spectrum has changed everything. And we're in a new era. And I think some of the previous conceptualizations are not all that helpful, particularly when other issues have crowded onto the agenda. For instance, sovereignty. 20 years, you had Omai in your Tunisia, Omai. Well, everyone thought sovereignty was dead as a dodo. Well, in 35 populist movements, regaining sovereignty, disentangling themselves from the multilateral system and looking at an order, international order where every country is for itself, very different, very different. So that's why I'm saying you have to try to deal with the uniqueness of the moment and put back to the political into political economy.
Well, thank you so much again, Daniel. Again, there's little for me to disagree with, right? Definitely, if I may just quickly respond, all these things are intertwined, like nativism, authoritarianism, nationalism, and populism, right? So in a way, I think where I would, well, the way I see your point is that perhaps my conceptualization is a bit too neat, right? By conceptualization of neo-nationalism. Well, on the other hand, I think as academics, we try to make clear what we're talking about, right? So, and by the way, Obrador is also part of my, Morena is part of my data set. I called it as left-wing neo-nationalist party, right? And actually, where I totally agree with you, Bolsonaro and Modi, they of course need to be accounted for, and I do not measure them in my data set because I focus more on neo-nationalist. So Bolsonaro for me is a neoliberal, authoritarian, populist leader who does not, in a way, well, I do not do Brazil as a case study, right? So I focus on OECD, but these are the leaders, Modi, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Trump, who are actually the agents, using my terminology, of the capital state. So they reinforce these dynamics, which caused the populist revolt in the first place, right? And this is why I'm a bit skeptical to lump them together with the right-wing social protectionist camp, because ideology of Le Pen, for example, is very different from that of Bolsonaro, economically speaking, right? But again, I absolutely agree. I do not account for dynamics like hate speech lies in my research. Definitely will be happy to look more into this, especially thanks to your book. And absolutely, Polanyi is worth rereading every time, definitely.
That's a very good way to end. And if you permit me, and I don't want, we're sort of coming to the end, but in listening to your conversation with Attila, with Daniel, especially given the recent publication of his book, and congratulations, Attila, for yours, which just came out. I don't want to sound too simplistic, and also in the interest of time, just to summarize. Daniel, it's not a question of agreeing with one. I think I agree with both of you, but what I think is important in the work that Oleksandr is doing is that it's the infrastructure. We used to talk, or the superstructure, or whatever you want to call it. This is fertile ground for the expression of the hate speech and the messaging that you refer to. That there was always an undercurrent of these views in all societies. But why? Why are these views flourishing? I hate to use the term flourish because nothing flourishing about it. Why are they contaminating rather than, why are they contaminating so many societies? And then the other thing, and I guess this is the subject for another conversation, but we had this, Daniel and I are part of a informal little group that meets periodically and really just chats informally about the state of the world. But I was saying in another context that I was always very nervous and skeptical about using terms like path dependency, and because there was a determinist, you underlying that is a determinism that you're culturally bound by history, and it's impossible to imagine anything different. But there is that argument as well that is bandied about, and namely many of the countries that you studied. I'm not referring to the whole, of the OECD map, but some of these Central and Eastern European countries. The element of path dependency. I mean, I've had these conversations with Attila and others in Hungary, and you lived there for 7 years. Why is it so difficult for democracy to take root, in Hungary and in other places? So and then the question becomes, a more liberal democracy like the United States, does that become more of a Polanyian story in the sense of the disenfranchised, rising up in revolt and rallying behind a Trump or Trump-like, Republicans in the U.S. and then engaging in this hate speech and system of messaging. So I guess the question is, and we could just have a very brief, is that how this, it's global, we see it across many countries, but is the role of path dependency also one that and it's just a term I'm throwing out, we don't have to, or determinism, also important in terms of understanding how this messaging takes hold, how quickly, how quickly it takes hold in certain societies, and how little resistance there is, versus a country like the United States, which is divided right down the middle, where there is a very powerful resistance, and it effectively has divided the country into two. But I guess this question is a way of really saying thank you to you, because your talk and your book are, it's a very rigorous, very rigorous study that is important, and I would even invite us to perhaps form a small group around the two books, yours and Daniel's, and discuss them in depth, because it raises so many important questions that we could continue discussing on another occasion. I don't know if you want to make a final comment, or maybe just a quick answer to some of the issues that I just raised, and then we can close right after that.
Well, thank you, Margie. Yes, so definitely this is a very interesting and important factor, right? So path dependency, or the political culture, right? The structures which exist. I think this is absolutely another factor which needs to be accounted for. And I think it does produce different results, right? Depending on different path dependencies, right? So this is not something I looked into. I look more into the political economic legacies like socialism or dirigism in France, right? So this is a bit different, I think. But absolutely, and yeah, you absolutely struck a chord with me, and something which can and should be discussed and considered. Well, in conclusion, I think it is absolutely great that we're coming from different perspectives, because I think this is how populism studies should progress. We all contribute in our own, ways to this debate, and this debate will never get resolved. And on the one hand, it's good, right? Because this is a huge topic, and politically speaking, I don't see populism or neo-nationalism fading away anytime soon. And in this case, the triumph of Democrats over, for example, Biden's victory, I think it's a bit premature or short-sighted. But definitely we should all continue in our own spirited way to this discussion. And finally, I would like to congratulate, to thank once again the organizers and the people I have met today. I have learned as well today, so thank you so much. And I hope our interactions will continue in one way or another. So thank you.
And thank you for initially reaching out to us. Thank you for very, very stimulating talk and conversation with us this morning. I hope it's to be continued in one way or another, by exchanges between you and others who are online, or perhaps we can look forward to a further conversation. Thank you so much, Oleksandr. Before